No one expected the Christmas interview to end like this. The lights were bright. The audience was smiling. Jonathan Roumie sat calmly in his chair on the view, hands folded, listening as the host spoke. At first, everything felt warm, festive even. Then the tone shifted. One question turned sharp. Another followed, colder than the last. What began as a discussion about Christmas traditions slowly turned into something else entirely. Faith. The hosts leaned in. 5 voices. One target. Jonathan didn't interrupt. He didn't raise his voice. He simply listened. But the studio atmosphere changed. The laughter faded. The audience grew uneasy. A host questioned why he spoke openly about his beliefs. Another suggested that faith didn't belong in modern entertainment. Someone else laughed, not kindly, but dismissively. Still, Jonathan remained composed. He had played one of the most recognizable roles of faith in modern television. He knew scrutiny. But this wasn't curiosity. This felt like pressure. Then came the moment no one saw coming. Jonathan looked down, reached for his microphone, and slowly unclipped it. The audience gasped. One host tried to speak, but the words didn't land. Another laughed nervously, unsure if this was part of the show. It wasn't. Jonathan stood up. The cameras scrambled to adjust. The producers froze. Millions watching at home leaned closer to their screens. This wasn't anger. This wasn't drama. It was quiet resolve. "I came here to talk about Christmas," he said calmly. "Not to apologize for my faith." Silence. Not the kind filled with noise, but the kind filled with meaning. In that moment, the interview stopped being entertainment. It became a statement. A reminder. That belief doesn't need applause. That respect isn't optional. And that sometimes, the strongest response isn't arguing louder. It's knowing when to stand up and walk away. What happened next would spark debate across social media, divide opinions, and leave one question echoing long after the cameras cut. Was Jonathan Roumie wrong for walking out? Or was he right for refusing to let his faith be diminished? And that's where the story truly begins. Earlier that morning, nothing suggested the interview would take such a turn. Jonathan Roumie arrived at the studio quietly, dressed simply, carrying the calm confidence of someone used to pressure but not driven by it. December decorations lined the halls, wreaths on the doors, soft lights wrapped around railings, Christmas music humming faintly through the building. It was supposed to be a seasonal conversation. Light, warm, safe. He greeted the crew with genuine smiles, shaking hands, thanking people by name when he could. To him, interviews weren't battlegrounds, they were conversations. Opportunities to share gratitude, reflect on the year, and speak honestly without performance. Backstage, a producer reminded him of the outline. Christmas traditions. Upcoming projects. A short discussion about inspiration. Nothing controversial. Jonathan nodded. He had done this many times before. He understood television. He understood questions that pushed boundaries. And he understood how to answer with grace. His faith had always been part of his life, not as a weapon, not as a slogan, but as a compass. He didn't force it into conversations. But he never hid it either. When he walked onto the set, the applause was warm and immediate. The hosts smiled, welcoming him enthusiastically. One complimented his recent work. Another joked about holiday stress. The audience laughed. The mood was friendly, comfortable. Jonathan sat down, relaxed, his posture open. The conversation began just as planned. They spoke about Christmas memories, childhood traditions, favorite songs, moments that felt meaningful. Jonathan shared a story about quiet mornings, reflection, and gratitude. He spoke gently, thoughtfully, choosing his words with care. The audience nodded along. Then, subtly, the questions shifted. One host asked how much of his personal beliefs influenced his work. The question sounded harmless enough. Jonathan answered honestly but briefly, saying his values guided how he treated people, not how he judged them. Another host followed up, this time sharper. "Do you think there's a line," she asked, "between faith and public influence?" Jonathan paused, sensing the change. He responded respectfully, acknowledging that everyone has different boundaries and that his intention was never to divide, only to be authentic. But the warmth in the room began to thin. The questions started to stack, one after another, less curious, more challenging. The smiles remained, but the tone beneath them shifted. What had been a conversation slowly became an examination. Jonathan noticed the audience reactions changing. Some leaned forward. Others exchanged glances. A few stopped smiling altogether. Still, he stayed composed. He spoke about respect, about coexistence, about listening more than speaking. He emphasized that faith, for him, was about humility, not superiority. Yet the interruptions increased. A host questioned whether visible faith belonged on mainstream platforms. Another implied that belief systems were outdated. Laughter followed, not from the audience, but from the table. Jonathan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. He realized this was no longer about Christmas. It wasn't even about dialogue. It was about testing how far he would bend. And he wouldn't. He remembered why he had accepted the invitation in the first place: to share joy, not defend his identity. To celebrate a season rooted in peace, not debate the right to believe. The cameras kept rolling. The lights stayed bright. But the atmosphere felt heavier with each passing second. Jonathan folded his hands together, grounding himself. He waited for a pause that never came. Each answer he gave was met with another challenge, another subtle dismissal. That's when he understood something clearly. Silence, in that moment, would speak louder than any explanation. And as the hosts prepared their next question, unaware of what was about to happen, Jonathan made a decision that would shift the entire room, and soon, the entire conversation online. Because sometimes, the most powerful setup isn't confrontation. It's restraint. And the stage was set for what came next. The shift wasn't sudden, it was deliberate. What had once felt like curiosity now carried an edge, sharp enough to be felt by everyone in the room. The hosts leaned closer to the table, questions arriving faster, overlapping, leaving little space to breathe. Jonathan answered one, only to be cut off mid-sentence. He began another, only to be redirected. The rhythm was no longer conversational. It was confrontational. One host tilted her head and smiled thinly. "Jonathan, don't you think openly discussing faith makes some people uncomfortable?" Another followed immediately. "Especially when religion has caused so much division." The words hung in the air. Jonathan nodded slowly, acknowledging the concern without surrendering his ground. He spoke calmly, choosing empathy over defensiveness. He explained that faith, to him, wasn't about control or exclusion. It was about responsibility, compassion, and self-reflection. But the answers didn't satisfy the table. They pressed harder. Should public figures be more careful? Should belief stay private? Isn't silence safer? Each question felt less like a search for understanding and more like a demand for retreat. The audience sensed it too. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few faces tightened. A handful nodded in agreement with the hosts, but many others watched quietly, waiting to see how far this would go. Jonathan remained steady, outwardly. Inside, he felt the familiar weight of being misunderstood. Not attacked loudly, but chipped away at carefully. He had experienced this before, in different rooms, under different lights. The expectation that belief must justify itself. That conviction must apologize for existing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt back. He simply said, "I believe we can disagree without dismissing one another." The response was a chuckle. Not cruel, but dismissive. And that was the moment something changed. The conversation stopped being about ideas. It became about dominance. A host leaned back and crossed her arms. "So are you saying critics are wrong to feel threatened by religion?" Jonathan inhaled slowly. "No," he replied. "I'm saying fear shouldn't be answered with ridicule." The studio went quieter. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't rehearsed. They were honest. But honesty doesn't always land gently. Another interruption came, sharper than before. "Isn't that just your interpretation?" Jonathan paused. He looked across the table, not searching for approval, but for respect. He didn't see it. What he saw instead was a conversation that had already decided its outcome. And that's when he stopped answering. Not abruptly. Not defiantly. He simply fell silent. The hosts filled the space, continuing to speak, continuing to frame the narrative. But the energy had shifted. The audience noticed. Silence, when intentional, has weight, and Jonathan's silence was heavy. He rested his hands on the armrests of his chair. His expression was calm, but resolved. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about refusing to be reduced. The hosts asked one more question, the kind that sounds polite but carries a sharp edge beneath it. Jonathan didn't respond. Instead, he reached down slowly and touched the wire of his microphone. The movement was subtle, but visible. A ripple passed through the studio. One host stopped speaking mid-sentence. Another glanced toward the producers. Jonathan unclipped the mic carefully, placing it on the table as though it mattered, because it did. The audience gasped softly. This was no outburst. No raised voice. No slammed chair. It was composure in motion. Jonathan stood up. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The cameras hesitated. The hosts froze between professionalism and surprise. Somewhere behind the scenes, a producer raised a hand, too late. Jonathan looked at the table one final time. "I'm happy to have conversations," he said quietly, "but not ones that require me to diminish who I am." The room held its breath. And just like that, the rising conflict reached its breaking point. Because what happens next wouldn't just end an interview. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Jonathan Roumie stood beside his chair, the microphone resting quietly on the table where it no longer belonged. The words he had just spoken lingered in the air, not loud, not dramatic, but firm enough to stop everything else. The studio was silent. Not the polished, television silence filled with background noise, but a real one. The kind that makes people aware of their own breathing. One of the hosts attempted a smile, the kind used to regain control when a segment slips off script. Another glanced toward the camera, then quickly away. No one spoke. No one seemed certain who should. Jonathan didn't rush. He adjusted his jacket slowly, respectfully, as if acknowledging the space he was leaving behind. There was no anger in his expression, only clarity. The kind that comes when a decision has already been made and no longer needs defending. He took a step back from the table. A murmur passed through the audience. Some leaned forward. Others froze. A few exchanged looks that said everything words couldn't. Phones remained down, unsure whether this was real or rehearsed. It wasn't. Jonathan turned toward the hosts one final time. "I respect dialogue," he said evenly. "But respect must be mutual. No accusation. No lecture. Just a boundary." Then he turned toward the exit. The cameras scrambled. A director's voice echoed faintly through the studio, unheard by viewers at home but felt in the sudden, awkward shift of energy. The hosts remained seated, caught between continuing the show and acknowledging what had just happened. One tried to laugh it off. "Well, that wasn't on the schedule," she said, her voice light but strained. The laughter didn't come. Jonathan continued walking. Each step was unhurried. Each movement deliberate. He wasn't storming out. He was leaving with intention. And that difference mattered. Behind him, the audience slowly began to process the moment. A few heads nodded subtly. Others looked conflicted. Some appeared uncomfortable, unsure which side of the moment they were expected to take. As Jonathan reached the edge of the stage, he paused briefly. Not for attention, but for composure. He didn't look back. The studio lights stayed bright, but something in the room dimmed. When the door closed behind him, the silence broke, not into applause, but into confusion. One host cleared her throat. "Well," she said, turning toward the camera, "we'll take a quick break." The words felt hollow. The segment cut abruptly, leaving millions of viewers at home staring at their screens, replaying the last few minutes in their minds. Social media feeds refreshed. Messages began to appear. Questions formed instantly. What just happened? Was that planned? Was that real? Backstage, Jonathan exhaled. Not in relief, but release. He handed the mic pack to a crew member, thanked them quietly, and nodded to a producer who looked stunned but respectful. There was no speech, no demand, no lingering. He simply left. Inside the studio, the hosts regrouped. Some looked defensive. Others appeared unsettled. The confidence that had filled the table earlier had thinned, replaced by careful glances and measured tones. Whatever control they believed they had was gone. Because the power had shifted. Not through argument, not through volume, but through refusal. The audience had witnessed something rare, not a celebrity meltdown, not a viral shouting match, but a calm act of self-respect unfolding in real time. When the show returned from break, the conversation moved on. But the moment didn't. It traveled. Across screens. Across platforms. Across opinions. Clips circulated within minutes. Commentary followed. Some praised Jonathan's composure. Others questioned his choice. Debates ignited, not just about the walkout, but about faith, respect, and the invisible lines people are expected to cross quietly. And somewhere in all that noise, one truth remained clear. Jonathan Roumie didn't leave because he was angry. He left because he knew his worth. And the reaction to that choice was only just beginning. The moment the broadcast cut to commercial, the story escaped the studio. Within minutes, short clips began circulating online, grainy at first, clipped mid-sentence, missing context but heavy with implication. Headlines followed quickly, each framing the moment differently. Jonathan Roumie walks off set. Faith sparks tense TV moment. Unexpected exit shocks viewers. No two summaries sounded the same. By the time the episode ended, social media had already chosen sides. Some viewers praised Jonathan's composure, calling his decision calm, principled, and overdue. They shared the clip with captions about boundaries, dignity, and the right to believe without apology. Others questioned his choice, arguing that public platforms invite challenge and that walking away avoids dialogue. The debate grew louder by the hour. Hashtags trended. Comment sections flooded. Reaction videos multiplied. Each retelling sharpened the moment further, amplifying expressions, tightening pauses, replaying the silence again and again. But beneath the noise, something deeper was happening. People weren't just reacting to a walkout. They were reacting to what it represented. For some, it was about faith being misunderstood or dismissed. For others, it was about media responsibility and power dynamics. For many, it was about respect, where it begins and where it ends. Clips from the interview were slowed down, analyzed frame by frame. Viewers debated the tone of the questions, the timing of the interruptions, the expressions on faces around the table. Some argued the conversation had been fair. Others insisted it had crossed an invisible line. Jonathan remained silent. He didn't post immediately. He didn't issue a statement. That silence became its own message. Meanwhile, commentators filled the space. Some defended the show, saying difficult questions were part of honest discussion. Others criticized what they saw as imbalance, 5 voices pressing one, with little room for mutual exchange. The hosts addressed the moment briefly on the next episode. They framed it as an unexpected reaction, emphasizing the importance of open conversation. Their words were measured, careful, designed to move forward without reopening the wound. But the audience hadn't moved on. Emails poured in. Viewer feedback spiked. Ratings analysts took note. Media critics weighed in, some applauding the tension as real television, others questioning whether provocation had replaced curiosity. Off-camera, conversations happened too. Among producers. Among guests scheduled to appear. Among viewers who saw pieces of their own experiences reflected in the moment. Because the walkout felt familiar. To anyone who had ever been talked over. To anyone who had been asked to explain themselves endlessly. To anyone who had felt expected to soften their identity to keep the peace. When Jonathan finally spoke, days later, it wasn't in an interview. It was a short, carefully worded message. He thanked those who had shown kindness. He reaffirmed his belief in respectful dialogue. And he made one thing clear. He hadn't walked away from conversation. He had walked away from dismissal. The message didn't inflame the debate. It steadied it. Some critics softened. Others remained unconvinced. But the tone shifted, becoming less about spectacle and more about reflection. What does respect look like on a public stage? Who decides which beliefs are acceptable to voice? And when does questioning cross into pressure? The moment continued to ripple outward. Not as a scandal, but as a mirror. Because everyone watching saw something different. Some saw courage. Some saw avoidance. Some saw themselves. And perhaps that was the real aftermath. Not agreement, but awareness. Jonathan Roumie returned to his work quietly, without grand declarations or victory laps. The show moved on to new segments, new guests, new controversies. But the question lingered, long after the lights dimmed. In a world that celebrates loud opinions and constant reaction, what does it mean to stand firm, without shouting? And is walking away sometimes the strongest voice of all? Those questions didn't trend as hashtags. But they stayed. And in that sense, the moment never truly ended. As the noise slowly settled, something quieter took its place. Away from headlines and comment sections, people began to reflect, not just on what happened, but on why it struck such a nerve. The walkout was no longer just a moment from a daytime show. It had become a reference point, a shared pause in an otherwise non-stop cycle of opinions. Jonathan Roumie returned to his routine without fanfare. No press tour. No victory speech. No public sparring. He went back to work, to rehearsals, to conversations that didn't require performance. Friends later described him as calm, unchanged. If anything, more grounded. He had said what he needed to say in the moment that mattered most. And that, for him, was enough. The public, however, was still processing. Some viewers admitted the moment made them uncomfortable, not because of what was said, but because of what it revealed. The imbalance of voices. The way certain questions lingered longer than others. The expectation that some beliefs should always be explained, while others are simply assumed. Others disagreed. They argued that public figures must face challenge, that difficult conversations are necessary, and that walking away can feel like closing a door rather than opening one. Both perspectives existed side by side. But what shifted was the tone. The conversation matured. It became less about who won, and more about what was learned. Media analysts pointed out something subtle but important. The walkout wasn't fueled by outrage. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic gestures. In a landscape where conflict is often rewarded, restraint stood out. And restraint made people listen. Jonathan's decision reframed the idea of strength. Not as domination. Not as endurance at all costs, but as clarity, knowing when participation no longer serves understanding. That idea resonated far beyond the show. Teachers referenced the moment in classrooms while discussing dialogue and boundaries. Faith leaders spoke about it not as a confrontation, but as an example of dignity. Even some critics acknowledged that while they disagreed with his choice, they respected how it was made. Respect, after all, doesn't require alignment. It requires recognition. The hosts, too, reflected, whether publicly or privately. No one involved emerged unchanged. Moments like that rarely leave people untouched, even if they move on quickly in front of cameras. Television thrives on momentum. Life doesn't. And in the days that followed, a quiet question echoed across conversations both online and offline. What do we owe one another when we disagree? Not just celebrities. Not just hosts. But all of us. Do we owe explanation? Endurance? Silence? Or do we owe something simpler? Space? Jonathan never framed his walkout as a moral stand above others. He didn't claim offense. He didn't label anyone an enemy. He simply chose not to continue a conversation that no longer felt reciprocal. That distinction mattered, because it shifted the focus from belief to behavior, from faith to fairness, from ideology to interaction. And perhaps that's where resolution lives, not in agreement, but in understanding limits. The story didn't end with applause or outrage. It ended with something rarer: pause. A pause long enough for people to ask themselves how they listen, how they question, how they disagree. In a world trained to respond instantly, that pause was powerful. Jonathan Roumie didn't walk away to make a point. He walked away because he had already made it. And in doing so, he reminded many that sometimes the most meaningful resolution doesn't come from the final word, but from knowing when no more words are needed. The cameras had long since moved on. But the lesson remained. When the moment finally faded from trending lists and breaking news banners, what remained wasn't outrage. It was a question. Not about a show. Not about a celebrity. But about us. Jonathan Roumie's walkout didn't force agreement. It didn't demand loyalty. It didn't even ask for understanding. What it did was quietly challenge something deeper, the way we treat people when we don't share their beliefs. Because the truth is, disagreement is easy. Respect is harder. In a culture that rewards interruption, confrontation, and the loudest voice in the room, restraint can feel almost radical. Walking away without anger. Speaking without accusation. Leaving without burning bridges. That kind of strength rarely goes viral, until it does. What made the moment resonate wasn't faith alone. It was posture. Calm in the face of pressure. Boundaries drawn without hostility. A refusal to trade dignity for airtime. And that's where the lesson lives. You don't have to win every conversation. You don't have to explain yourself endlessly. You don't have to stay where respect is conditional. Sometimes, the most honest response is simply knowing when the conversation has stopped being mutual. Jonathan didn't walk off because he was silenced. He walked off because he chose silence over distortion. That distinction matters. Because there is a difference between dialogue and interrogation. Between curiosity and control. Between challenge and dismissal. And recognizing that difference is a form of wisdom. The story also reminds us that respect isn't about agreement. It never has been. True respect allows room for difference without demanding surrender. It listens as much as it speaks. It questions without cornering. When respect disappears, conversation becomes performance. And performance, no matter how polished, rarely leads to understanding. For some watching, the moment affirmed their belief that faith deserves space in public life. For others, it raised concerns about how conversations are framed on powerful platforms. For many, it had nothing to do with religion at all, and everything to do with boundaries. We've all been there. In meetings where our words were dismissed. In rooms where we were outnumbered. In conversations where listening stopped. Most of us didn't have the option to stand up and walk away on live television. But we understood the feeling. And maybe that's why the moment stayed with people. Because it reflected something universal, the quiet strength it takes to choose self-respect over validation. Jonathan Roumie never asked to be a symbol. But symbols often emerge when actions align with principle. Not loudly. Not intentionally. But clearly. And clarity has weight. As the season of Christmas reminds many of reflection, humility, and peace, the timing of the moment felt almost symbolic. A reminder that belief, whatever form it takes, is deeply personal, and that honoring it in others costs nothing. In the end, the story wasn't about walking out. It was about standing firm. About knowing who you are before you enter the room, so you don't lose yourself inside it. That's the moral that lingers. Respect doesn't begin when we agree. It begins when we listen. And it endures when we allow others to leave with their dignity intact. Because one day, each of us will face a moment where we must choose between being accepted or being authentic. And when that moment comes, may we have the courage to choose wisely. Not with noise. Not with anger. But with grace.